All right, apocalypse. So there's a couple of notices I should make before I start this episode. First thing is that there might be wind. It's kind of pleasant breeze conditions here, but I noticed when testing the audio that it still picks up, and it's obvious enough. That's what you're hearing. If you start to hear my voice less well, but you should still be able to hear my voice. Also, you might be wondering, what's with the weird location? What's with the dirt patch right in front of the camera? And then the playground rather than a tree or something, or a stream. I actually found a really nice, pleasant little place to record where you got grass and a couple of trees. But I don't know if you can see it on the left. But right as I got there, some park services people came up in a truck and started digging a hole like 10 feet in front of me. It's not their fault. They're just doing their job. But that was kind of funny. I was like 2 minutes into the video and it's like, oh, okay. But anyway, so I found this is the only other private place I could find. Well, at least with shade. And I might want to cut the video short if I don't do it under shade. Plus the computer would die faster. It's for this. I might be under limited time all the same for this episode. But the thing is that I'm currently, what you're seeing in front of you, the dirt patch, is part of a baseball diamond. I come to this park moderately often, and I see people at this baseball diamond quite frequently. It seems that today, I guess, is the day that there isn't baseball practice for like the middle schoolers, but maybe not. Maybe it just starts at like 2 or something. It's like noon right now, so I've got an hour, maybe. Might be 1 by now. Also, actually getting into the series, you might be wondering why I call it Apocalypse rather than Survival. The Survival series, with the Survival series, I was planning on coming up with ideas for responses to apocalypses and how to survive within them. But I realized that I also wanted to expand that first episode where I went over the vague categories of the types of apocalypses. And I wanted to more or less go over more apocalypses. And I realized that either what I could do is I could do what I usually do, which is create a new series. The problem is well, first of all, the problem is in that first episode, I called it Survival, 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 Survival. Well, I didn't call it that, but I said survival repeatedly. So it'd be kind of hard to say like, oh, wait, no, not only is the series now called Apocalypse, but there is an actual survival series and this isn't part of it. That'd be kind of hard to say. Not to mention the fact that did set up the series, so I would probably want to use that as the first episode of Survival, even though it wouldn't have fit. So what the problem that I discovered is that the main problem is that these two series are going to be pretty much tied together. In the first, like I can talk about an apocalypse, but I'm probably going to want to spend at least a third of that episode saying like, okay, so aliens are on the Earth and they want to kill all humans. Fine. And I'll talk about the different aspects of that, but then I'll also talk about the different unique qualities of needing to survive within this world. These series are two connected, so I'm more or less creating one and just calling it Apocalypse. That would be Apocalypse Survival and Apocalypses, I guess. It's the same with the survival aspect of this. I'll still want to say like, okay, you're going to want this and this, but you might want to get this, even though it might be useless if it's chemical weapons rather than nukes or something like that. So I'll talk about the different types of apocalypses there too. Anyways, these series are going to intermix a lot too much. So since these probably won't come out that often, I don't know. It might be like politics where it's just suddenly like, oh, episode 8 or something like that. But it also might be, or it also might just almost never happen. So you might as well just make one series of it. Like Society. That show, I almost should have merged it into something like politics, because those episodes come out very infrequently. But either way, I thought I should merge the series. And on top of that, that saves me the hassle of creating a new series and figuring out what to do with that first episode, if I should film a different episode of Survival, how I should try to explain why those are two different series, even though they reconnect to each other repeatedly. So instead, this is Apocalypse. Now to the actual problem. I don't believe that there is an overpopulation crisis. There's about 7.5 billion people on the planet right now. I believe that's a problem. I mean, I'd say about 4 billion people, and we could pretty much have, well, North America everywhere. Has its problems, especially in the southern part of the continent, but, not awful problems, and we can deal with it. There's not a large population that's really starving, other than maybe the homeless in the places with the worst problems. So, yeah, with about 4 billion, we could do that, rather than have places like, like Africa. A huge continent. There's plenty of countries in Africa which are doing fine, like South Africa. The fact is, there's a lot of them which aren't, and a lot of them which have just purely starving populations. They also have 1.3 billion people, to be fair, so does China, but, and they're not a continent, but still. The thing is, and I'm sure China has some starving going on too, that many people, even if it's just like their poorest homeless people, I'm sure that's still like 100,000 people or something crazy. So then we could probably live pretty comfortably at 4 billion. That said, I remember hearing that the total max, if we lived under total communism, like total perfect communism, not Stalin communism, but total perfect communism, where it was, where everybody worked really hard and everybody got their fair share and all that. If we lived under that kind of system, which of course is impossible, but just theoretically for the max number of people on Earth, I think it was like 12.5 billion, that is, which seems, well, that's at 7.5, and considering we were at 7, I don't know, a year ago, 2 years ago or something like that, that doesn't give the human race a lot of time, especially since we're getting exponentially larger. So getting from 7 to 8 took less time than from 6 to 7, and 8 to 9 will take less time as well. So the thing, though, is that I don't believe that that's a crisis. I believe it's a problem, because I'm personally someone who would like that 4 billion people world, where, you could, even in a city, you could find a place where there just isn't another person nearby, at least within 100 feet. But I live in a moderately small town, and I tell you, that place doesn't exist. Well, okay, it does. In some of the more weird parks, if I waded into the tall grass, I could probably find a spot. But, it's the kind of thing where there's a lot of people and they're everywhere. And I'm from North America, of course, so we're not really packed down in terms of population. It would be awful to live. I don't know. I could never imagine myself living in a place like Asia and not going insane, because it's, go to the park, there's 400 people there. Go to the grocery store, there's 800. That kind of stuff. The only place I'd ever have solitude is at home, and then since they have so many people, the homes are tinier too. So, yeah. So, but I think it's not a crisis, though, because I think once we get to a certain level, it's going to come down to the fact that if people keep having kids, their kids are just going to die, and nobody does that. I know that people look at third world countries and say oh, they're so backwards, they're starving, and yet they have 12 kids. But the unfortunate truth about those situations is they're having those 12 kids because they don't expect the 12 kids to live. People generally seem to have about 3 kids. In any society, 2.5 is an average or something like that. If they have to have 12, so that 2.5 on average will live to the age where they can have their own 2.5, then not, of course, not being half a kid, but one family will have two, one will have three, and then it's split evenly. Anyways, so they'll have their 2.5, and then but they'll have 12, and 2.5 of them will live to the age where they can, on average, 2.5 will live to the age where they can have their own 2.5. So that's the problem. But if we get to a point where we don't solve those problems, I mean, let's go solve poverty. But if we get to a point where we, and as I believe we will, where we, is that a drone? Huh. Yeah, if we get to a point where we haven't solved those problems, but we still have a lot of people, it's going to come down to the fact that they can have their 12 kids. None of them are going to live to that age, or maybe one will, or something like that. So that's the point when I believe people will just stop having kids, because kids are a pretty huge investment, but they're still worth it as long as you can well, our natures tell us that it's still worth it as long as we can still replicate our individual DNA. But if we get to a point where they're just not surviving because there's physically too many people, which I think will probably happen around like 10, maybe 10.5, maybe 11, maybe if we really, really push it, and we'd like get smaller as a species, like everybody's 5'5", kind of thing, then we could probably hit, maybe, I say hesitantly, like 11 or 11.5, but honestly, I think it'll probably happen at about 10.5, maybe 10 3/4 of a billion, or 10 3/4 billions. And at that point, we're pretty much just going to hit stable populations. My problem is we're currently at 7, and I already feel overcrowded in a country which is the least overcrowded continent, or in a continent which is the least overcrowded continent, and the only continent which is its own country is Australia. And not even really them, because there's New Zealand, part of Oceania. But the thing is, I'm living in the least crowded continent, and I already feel overcrowded, so I wonder what it's going to be like when there's an extra, more or less, 3 billion people. Thankfully, if this is 7, it can't get that bad. It's just going to be like this, but what's 3/7 worse, or 3 7.5 worse. So the thing about that is, all right, so I just did the calculation on my phone. 40% worse. That's how many people we can get. All of our problems can get 40% worse, which not great considering our problems currently feel overwhelming, but we'll deal with it. So the problem is, I think that the real problem, which of course isn't the crisis, is that we're going to hit that stage and then stay there, which means all our problems are distinctly difficult right now. Or we're going to get to a point where we have our problems, but 40% worse, and then we're just going to stick there. Maybe we can solve some stuff, but maybe we can't. And I feel like that is, I feel how close we are on a daily basis to war with countries with nukes. Or, like North Korea, for instance, which keeps threatening to bomb, well, the West in general, but the United States mostly. And they keep getting bombs and bombs that are getting closer and closer to it. But then there's also stuff like a whole bunch of other countries like Japan and South Korea are talking about getting their own nukes. And I know that's nuclear, I forgot the word. But, more people with nukes, more chances that someone's going to use a nuke is what it comes down to. And as soon as one starts, chances are lots of other ones are going to. It might happen, like a nuke can go off, Tokyo or Washington, D.C. can disappear and we won't destroy the world, but the chances are that we can't. My guess is that we can't. I doubt that we can get to a point where we can lose a major city like that. What it comes down to is nobody expects us to. Nobody expects to have a major city of a country with nukes get wiped out and not have some major retaliation. So, of course, there isn't a huge pressure for it to happen. At this point, we're pretty much putting our reliance on nobody's going to use a nuke, right? Because if we do, oh boy. And that's unfortunately creating its own situation, which is that if anyone actually does, there's no expected buildup at that point. There's no default response. It isn't like, okay, they nuked us once, we'll nuke them once. There's no Geneva Convention of nukes. It's pretty much just like the countries with nukes have promised to make sure that not very many countries get nukes, but they're not really doing that anymore. And the countries with nukes have promised to not nuke each other, maybe, probably not, And I feel like if we have 40% more people and 40% more problems, we're just putting ourselves, the chance of nuking each other is 40% worse. And it's already kind of up there. It's relying on a hair. There's a whole bunch of different stuff lying on a hair. The only positive thing the only major positive thing is that the more people we have, the more good people we have who will be trying to actively prevent the world from ending, which will be nice. As much as the world is lying on a hair between us and nuclear apocalypse, there's also a couple thousand people, maybe million, in this world who are actively trying to keep that hair from splitting and releasing the nuclear flood, as it were. So the thing about this is, I don't think that we can exist for more than 100 years at that point. Once we hit the 10 and a half, 10 and 3/4, maybe 11, once we hit that point, we're not going to be able to exist for too long. If nothing else, the countries which don't overpopulate too much are going to start packing on more. So we're going to hit that 10 and a half, and then places like North America and like Canada. There's one, for instance. Canada, pretty much icy tundra, but they have enough farmland and a peaceful enough government that if the rest of the world started packing on, so would they. They'd go from like 50 million or whatever in Canada right now to something like 400,000 or something, which is probably the peak of that country for all their size. There's limits on food. So you'd get to the point where you'd get to your like 10. That's why I say like 10 and a half rather than 10, because you're going to get to like 10, and then it's going to be down to places like, like Asia just won't be able to have more. They'll have to hit their population at exactly 2.0, or people will start starving. And more likely they'll just have it at like everybody gets one kid for a while. They'll do something like that. As unpopular as that is, starving isn't popular either. That's a bad situation, by the way. They either get to tell people you don't have the right to have as many kids, and I know in Asia, maybe in other places too, if you only get to have one kid, you tend to want to have a male, not because reproduction is hard when everybody has a male, but males are more likely to get higher within society in those kinds of places. Feminism might have worked its magic in those places by now, so that people won't do that anymore, but they might still. And what are they going to do? On top of the whole you can only have one kid thing, tell certain people you also have to have a female. That's everything about this situation, about the limiting of population, just screams to me riots, major, like 100,000 people marching in the streets of Beijing level riots, which might seem fun, but they're not. That's the kind of stuff that destroys worlds. And of course, I don't think anyone thinks it's fun to be in the riot, but like if you're not a fan of China, chances are you'll think, oh, they deserve it. Well, guess what? If 100,000 people start rising up in Beijing, chances are well, anyways, that's a different concern. With those numbers of people, it's going to come down to the fact that, like, China and Asia in general probably just can't have any more people. And then you'll be at the point where it's like, okay, fine, Asia can't have any more people. North America's fine. Europe is somewhere in between fine and not fine in terms of population, probably still at that point. Africa, as chaotic as Africa is, if Africa were totally stabilized, as stabilized as North America anyways, which of course still has its own crazy crap going on in certain places, I mean, I know there's certain places in the desert of, I think like Nevada or something like that, which are just completely like, it would cost too much to have law there. So they're just like, do what you want. You can murder each other. We don't care. What it comes down to is, even if Africa was stabilized to that, or if it was stabilized to that point, it could probably pack on another billion or two. I doubt it will happen, though, because population's only going to make problems worse, of course, 40% worse. Yeah. What it's going to come down to is we're going to get Asia filled up. Africa is going to fill up as much as it can, despite its chaos. Europe's going to fill up. And then, of course, it'll be happening at the same time as Europe and Africa. But North America will start packing on people, and that's why I say 10.5 instead of 10 or something like that, because you're going to get 500 million to fill up America, and then we're just going to be at the point where we don't have enough food to go around. So, overpopulation, I do not believe itself is a crisis. Overpopulation is a problem, which makes every problem 40% worse. And since we're already, not exactly, wonderfully peaceful environment already, chances are we're not going to last. We're not going to last more than 100 years in a max population environment. I'm not saying it has to be an apocalypse, but in the very least, something's going to happen, like the breadbasket countries, like pretty much North America in general. But places like Germany are just going to say, like, all right, at this point, we're just not going to export any food whatsoever. We're just going to keep our population alive, and that's going to create some sort of wars. For places like Switzerland, which is in the middle of Europe, despite the fact, and is very populated, but it's only populated by virtue of being surrounded in very populated places. It itself cannot support that crazy population. It's the same with places like Japan, which even if they went crazy against their culture and started chopping down those forests and replacing them with farmland, they could probably support like 80,000 as a max, and they've got like 125,000 people there. And they're heavily reliant on food exports or food imports and technological imports or exports. Food imports, technological outports to pay for the food imports. I guess in conclusion about this video, overpopulation is not itself a problem, but it makes every problem much more distinctly on edge. All right, enjoy the generalized outro.